Hey, it's Kelly, Doctor of Physical Therapy at Physical Therapy U. Today I wanted to talk to you about strains versus strains. A lot of people get them confused and they just kind of throw the term out there. So today we're going to talk to you about what they are and what it means and how you can tell what you have. So a sprain happens to a ligament and a strain can happen to a tendon or a muscle. So first we'll talk about sprains, which happen to ligaments. So a ligament is connective tissue. It's like a fibrous connective tissue made of collagen, and ligaments stabilize joints for the most part. They connect bones to other bones. So we have ligaments pretty much in all of our joints. I can show you, this is like a poster of like all the ligaments. But anyways, you can kind of see they're in pretty much every joint: shoulder, hip, knee, elbow, hand, every little part of the hand there. Ankle, obviously everybody knows about that one. You get sprained ankles all the time. So there are different grades of ligament sprains, grades 1 through 3, depending how much is torn. Even if you have a grade 3 sprain of, let's just say, your ankle, that doesn't necessarily mean surgery. You could be put in a boot and crutches and all that stuff, and those ligaments can still heal. Average healing time for a sprain is around 6 weeks. That's give or take how bad the sprain was, and if it was, grade 1 versus grade 3. Once you have a sprain, you are a little bit more likely to have another one, unless you go ahead and get treated and really stabilize that joint. So things to do if you end up with a sprain, whether it's an ACL sprain or an ankle sprain, you want to ice, rest, kind of that classic RICE formula. So rest, ice, compression, and elevation, all of those help. Physical therapy, of course, so that we can really maximize your strength in other areas to stabilize that joint. And sprains happen a lot of times just trip and fall. A lot of times it's a twisting force on the knee. Those ligaments are there to stabilize those joints. So if you have multiple sprains, you're at a higher risk to have another one because your joint isn't as stable, and then you're at a higher risk for more damage like a tear or a fracture or something like that. So definitely if you have sprains, if you have a history of sprains, you want to make sure you're stabilizing that joint with strength and flexibility as needed. Strains, so let's go back to strains. So everybody thinks that classic one, like I pulled a hammy. That's a strain because you're pulling that muscle. So you can you can be talking about the tendon or the muscle. Again, with a strain, there's 3 grades of a strain, small to large, depending how bad the tear is, how many muscle fibers or tendon fibers are actually torn. And we talk a little bit about tendons. What tendons do, they connect muscles to bones. So all of our muscles have tendons. Here's a chart, and I know I'm sorry about the glare here. This is a chart of all the muscles in the body. So you can see the reddish color is the muscle, and then the white is the tendon where it connects, either to the bone or to another area. So with a strain, you're kind of overstretching that area. A lot of times it happens with a deceleration event, like landing from a jump or something like that. You might tear the muscle fibers a little bit. Again, like I said, there's 3 grades. If you do end up with a strain, the best thing to do, rest, ice. You're going to have pain, you're going to have swelling in that area, you will probably have bruising in the area as well. That's common with sprains and strains. And then, you want to rest, you want to ice it. Eventually down the line, once the swelling is resolved and the bruising's kind of resolved, heat can help with a strain, with a muscle strain. If you're, frequently having hamstring strains, sometimes people use those nice compression sleeves either for their calves or their hamstrings. Those tend to work really well. And then just, again, obviously I'm going to promote PT, but physical therapy so that you can strengthen where you are weak, either in that muscle that was actually injured or strained, or in muscles in the surrounding area, just to really stabilize and support that muscle that's been injured. So strain, typical time to heal would be 3 to 6 weeks, depending, again, whether it's a grade 1 or a grade 3 strain. So that's it. Sprains happen to ligaments. Strains happen to tendons and muscles. Rest, ice with both of them. 3 to 6 weeks for healing time. That's all. Thanks for listening.